but with adaptation co-benefits. For example, the solar PV power plants that you have in say, the desert to power have significant. And in my view, there is plenty of money, and that's why I say to power hinges a lot on, apart from grants, but also significant debt. Because once projects develop, they can afford to pay the debt and shareholder returns. However, you find that adaptation projects are normally very country and region specific. And therefore, they are not amenable and they are not attractive, because whereas a good mitigation project, I can talk about the rate of return of that particular project. Rare that you have an adaptation project that you can talk about the return on investment. In other words, for adaptation projects, what you'll have is a packet of information saying that, for example, we have been able to provide, to increase by so much. We've been able to improve food productivity by so much, which are not amenable to conversion into rates of return and that kind of thing. Thank you very much.
So, Catherine, is this part of the methodological problem that you see? Projects?
I think so, but what I wanted to maybe add is that we talk a lot about energy, but I think adaptation goes far beyond energy. And I think we should not forget all the other sectors where actually adaptation is critical. One of them, for instance, urbanization, we know is a major factor, element happening also as a result of climate change. Urbanization is growing, and we need to make cities better adapted to future effect of climate change, like flooding and all that. And I think there, it's just I wanted to say, we focus of energy, and I think it's a wonderful sector. But there are other sectors, agriculture. I think Carla mentioned it as well. Very important as well. It's also very important because it's also agriculture is important to feed people, to give them livelihoods, but it's also a source of environmental hazard as well. So I just wanted to make the case, but I think otherwise, yes, all these issues that Kevin mentioned are there. For me, it was important to also widen a bit the scope of the discussion, if I may. Thank you.
And Carla, in the Gateway Initiative, agriculture features. You want to talk about that a little, and then we'll try to close?
Global Gateway, it's covering all the key sectors we mentioned, and the Commissioner Sacco mentioned the agriculture, all the challenges that we have in the put in place food system that require a lot of intervention. Include also, because we mentioned include also forests. We are working with many countries in Africa. Just President van der Leyen conclude agreements with, for example, in Africa, Congo, Uganda, Zambia, just to foresee projects and the program to conserve, to better use, to restore, but to better sustainable use the forest, just to increase also all the question of carbon sequestration. So there is different sectors that are really covered by the Global Gateway. What is important is what we can do to facilitate investment from the public, investment from the private sector, answering really to the needs of each country. And we are not talking about all the needs, because really the question is to look and each partner and to focus and to give an answer depending on the needs, on the gap, country by country, at the country level.
Carlos, I'm going to give you the last word. You've talked to us about the right to pragmatism, and we see so much climate injustice already. There's also the issue of energy justice. But as you look ahead, you've earned the privilege now of sitting back after being in the multilateral system and just looking ahead. Africa needs about 2.6 trillion to deal with adaptation issues A lot of them are rising from problems we did not create. What's the way forward as you look beyond COP27?
Well, I think we have to define what is just transition. Everybody's talking about just transition, but in fact, the just in the transition as a geographical footprint, and we need to address it. And I think it is possible. Reaching a point, we can almost tip a point where most of the rules of engagement in the multilateral system will be challenged. I think the global economic architecture is going to change. It will change on the trade front because we'll be much more amenable to introduce environmental dimensions. And we are also going to be much more concerned about the impacts of global value chains in terms of security. It will change in the financial sector because during the pandemic we have thrown the rule book that could affect mechanisms and different instruments that didn't exist. It will change also in terms of the intellectual property because the regimes have been too much conditioned by wealth accumulation, and wealth accumulation is attaining a level that is absolutely impossible to sustain. And for all those reasons, we are going to witness a change even in the definition of productivity. It will no longer be where it's the most efficient to produce. It will be where it's most safe from an environmental perspective or from geopolitical considerations. And that is going to completely introduce of discussion that we are not yet prepared for. So I think we have to be ready to exercise agency from the African side, to participate in these changes with interests in mind. It's going to be a battle. It's not going to be easy, but it's possible.
Let me thank the NEPAD, the Africa Climate Foundation, and the Africa Europe Foundation for putting this together. We will continue these dialogues. We have to continue. We have to keep making the case that we're all in this together. But COP27 is about action. We hope by the time COP28, about real evidence. Because when we're coming here now, I'm a parliamentarian now. So I sit on the other side and I say, whoa, we're going to hear trillions of dollars again. And then come back 2 years, none touch the very vulnerable countries. If I have a number here, but I don't want to announce it, how many vulnerable countries have not received a single dime from the Green Climate Fund because of these methodological challenges? So the funds are there, but we can't access. So we hope this dialogue will continue. We want to thank our panel very much. Thank you for your time. Group picture with the partners.
Hello, as you leave, there is light food there, so you can just make your way to the table and grab some bites.
Hello, hello, test mic. Hello, test mic. Hello, 1, 2, test mic. Hello. Hey, test. Hello, check. والله ما هقدر. والله ما هقدر. الو الو تسمعوا؟ الو هي هي تست مايك. هي 1 2 1 2. هي تست مايك. الو hello check. Hello check. Hey test mic. 1 2 1 2 1 2. Hello, hello, hey test mic. Hey test mic. Hello check. 1 2 1 2. هتنزل نار في معدتي. مش هقدر. مش قادر اشرب اي حاجه. والله ما قادر. والله فعلا ما قادر. Hey test mic. 1 2 1 2 1 2. Hello check. Hey, test mic. Hey, test. Hello, check. Hello, check. 1 2 1 2. Hello, check. Hey, test mic. Hey, test. Hey, test. Hello, check. Hey, test mic. Hey, test mic. Hey, test. 1 2 1 2. Hey, test. Hello, check. Hello, check. Hey, test mic. Hey, test mic. Hey. Hello, check. 1 2 1 2. Hey, check. Hey.
Good evening, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your presence. We will begin shortly in the next 5 minutes. We apologize for the delay. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Can we get your attention, please? We are so pleased to be having these important sessions, really, financing African net zero transitions and the role of global bank and financial institutions. You all agree with me that the most important challenge on this part is essentially the financing part. Yeah, there is a technology, but sometimes even technology requires that we have the financing for it to spin up. So within the African continent, the challenge of financing the transitions are actually very much aggravated by what we call the high perception premium, which is such that the fiscal incidence of sovereign debt has become a major constraint to domestic resource mobilization, making it almost impossible to have enough resources locally, domestically, to finance the transitions. And add to that, the fact that the inflows of actually climate financing within the is already very low, and currently Africa is receiving just about 5.5% of total green financing. Think about that, which is quite significant. The region which is the most exposed to the climate crisis is actually receiving the least in terms of climate financing. And so today we have a major opportunity to begin to look at this issue, what can be done within the continent and globally to begin to address that financing gap. And it's so timely because the latest data point that we received just last month tell us that, think about this, the green bond issuance, 75% of green bond issuance in the first half of this year went to advanced economies. So collectively, the global south received just about 25%. So the prospects are not very encouraging unless there is a bold measure. And today we are going to be discussing that because reality is that without just climate financing, there will not be a just transitions. Will not be just transitions. So we have to find a way to increase, to address that financing gap so that more resources flow where it is needed the most. So again, that background, I think the main objective of these sessions are essentially three main objectives. Exploring the role that global financial institutions can play to fast-track the process of transitions, just transitions. Reflecting on innovative financing instruments that global financial institutions can put forward or deploy to close the financing gaps. And reflecting on reform that could be undertaken so that we have essentially a global financial system that is working for all in a way that the green transition will be more inclusive and more fair and synchronized transitions. And to reflect on these important issues, we have an impressive panels of CEO and global leaders who actually are not just in the space of financing, but also great intellectuals and thinkers, as you will see as we go through this exercise. And in terms of a quick introduction, we have Mrs. Sonia Gibbs from IIF, Institute of International Finance. She represents 400 global banks globally. So we have to push her as hard as we can to bring some of that money into the continent to close that gap. We have, to the extreme left, Mr. Samaila Zubairu, the CEO and President of African Finance Corporations, and he has the difficult mandate of actually addressing infrastructure financing gap within the continent. That was already a major challenge. Now he has to do it in a greener way, in the greening way. Think about that. And next to him is our president, which is Professor Benedicto Rama, really who has been essentially the champions of transforming African economy through trade. And I have to also worry about the greening part of it. And intellectually, he has actually been making a very important point that we are not going to decarbonize our way to the graveyard. And interestingly, the recent development has proven him right, as Europeans are torn between energy crisis and growth. You saw many going back to the most polluting type of energy. So I think our president is right in saying that we have to be very balanced in this debate. So we have a very robust panel to really cover these issues. And our president has actually been so forceful on that energy front that he received just last month the Africa Energy Person of the Year award. I think it tells you how important he's actually been pushing on that particular front. In terms of rule of the games, we are going to quickly invite our panelists to actually share their thoughts, about 2-3 minutes each, about what they think about this topic and why is it so important with important African lenses. Should we start with you or our host? Let's start with the host, our president.
No, thank you very much, Chief Economist Hippolyte. And let me also take the opportunity to thank panelists, Samaila and Sonia, for joining us today, and all of you for finding the time this evening despite the stresses and strains of walking around this big venue to be here this evening. Well, I think you've set out the matter the way it should be. We as a continent have to decide and determine what the climate debate means to us. There's no doubt in my mind that what it means to Africa is what we and the entire world should do to help us manage the crisis. Those who have been engaged in excessive and reckless carbon emissions have the damage they've actually inflicted on us. This is what the debate should be for us in Africa. I don't think the climate debate is uniform. It cannot be put as a uniform debate and then we are going to be talking about to green everywhere because you're already green. Somebody who is green cannot be greener than green. What we are talking about is that we are suffering flood, extreme weather conditions, maybe by virtue of where we are in the world in terms of latitude and longitude. So the weather effect, the changes in climate affects us more. And we didn't do anything. We didn't contribute to it. We haven't even carbonized. We haven't done anything. As I said in other panels, some of our children are still studying with bush lamp. So they cannot be told to go and decarbonize what? Whereas, in other parts of the world that have been industrialized, they've been able to build their infrastructure, they can cope and mitigate whatever the climate brings to them, they can manage them better. But unfortunately, most of the emissions come from there. So the debate for them will be too green. They should go down. They should reduce carbon drastically. While we all find ways to get the money to manage the damage that has been caused to us, because that damage can have global consequences. If we ignore it and think we are somewhere else in the world, if flooding is happening and the desertification is happening in some parts, it doesn't affect me. It will affect you because there will be migration issues, there will be diseases, and all sorts of things that will be coming and it will be global. So helping us to manage the damage will help the world. It's also then important that those who are contributing or who have contributed cumulatively and on a daily basis to the carbon emissions begin to be more disciplined and go down, so that we get to an equilibrium where those who are suffering their conditions are improved, and the emissions that others are releasing are better controlled. So in other words, FOFAC, I think we have to have a differentiated approach. And we should not have just one, one approach to it. Just say we are doing climate finance, because they don't mean the same thing. Yes. Climate finance does not mean greening all the time. Climate finance means also financing to deal with the damage caused by climate change. Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President. Thank you very much for that strong opening remark on setting the stage as to what ought to be done. Let's hear from the globalist.
Okay, excellent, good. Well, I'm glad I have a functioning microphone, because my first task is to address your earlier question. You know, you mentioned the 600 global banks. We can just close the discussion, because I brought my checkbook, right? I mean, Wolfgang has my handbag there, and we have them all writing checks, so deal done. But, you know, more seriously, it is the topic here at COP, is mobilizing climate finance for emerging and developing economies. There is no topic more important. And I think on the positive side, the awareness of this need for mobilizing capital has never been higher. So that's on the good news. But coming right down to brass tacks, we are at a really difficult time for capital flows to emerging markets, any kind of capital flows, right? Climate flows, we've got rising interest rates, we have a strong US dollar, we have high inflation. We have a lot of risk aversion out there, and one of the central parts of this conversation is how do we get over this risk aversion? We were talking earlier about a risk premium on emerging markets and on in Africa specifically, a risk premium. And the question becomes, is that perception of a risk premium justified? You know, and that's one of the questions I think we're going to talk about today. But because of this risk aversion, we do a lot of work on capital flows at the IIF, and our estimates suggest that capital outflows from emerging markets are worse now than they have been since the taper tantrum in 2013. That's a long time ago. That's a lot of outflows. It's a bad backdrop to where we are now. So we need to look beyond the difficult environment that we have right now. How do we get sustainable, affordable capital to flow from developing to emerging economies, because that's vital for growth and development goals. You know, the spending numbers, you've all seen them on the financing gap, whether it's climate, sustainable development goals. We're talking trillions. Capital flows at best are in the billions, so we have a long, long way to go. And there's a couple of challenges that I would mention before I get to the more optimistic points here. One is that transactions in emerging markets, for example, think about infrastructure projects. They tend to be very individual, unique, bespoke. So it's hard to scale up and standardize these kinds of flows, because that's what you need to tap into big pools of global capital. You need a lot of, you know, debt securities that look exactly alike, that they're comfortable with, that have a high credit rating and so on. So this brings up the really important role of de-risking, of working with the multilaterals, to bring down the cost of climate finance. You know, there is no topic more important. And that includes new technologies, because new technology is inherently risky. So you're kind of combining, in an emerging market context, two different kinds of risk, right? The traditional emerging market risk premium and the premium that has to do with climate investments. Sometimes these involve untested technologies and so on. So you've got a lot of de-risking to do. So that's a big job. And then the third challenge, I'd say, has to do with the policy and regulatory backdrop. For example, If you really want to have an enabling environment for climate finance, you're going to have a global carbon price. We are a long way from that. So we've got to work with an imperfect environment and do the best we can. But I'm going to leave this with reasons for optimism.
Please.
And I want to just mention a couple of things here. One is the tremendous interest in ESG investment. Those funds really can get to the trillions. And if we can de-risk and channel those ESG flows toward even a small percentage of them. You know, you mentioned the green bonds not being to scale in emerging markets. That's a big source of capital to tap there, and that's got a lot of potential. Second, there's been a lot of improvement on some of the fundamentals of ESG investing. We're getting better data. We're getting better disclosure. We now have an International Sustainability Standards Board, which is great. You've got some technologies which can get us better data. And there's also been improvement in investor relations. This is an important part of ESG investing, that the countries and companies that they invest in are transparent, are clear about what they're doing, they've got good legal, regulatory frameworks. There's been a lot of improvement over the years, and I personally think that improvement has been undersold. It's not been well communicated, so that's more potential there. You've got the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ. A lot of emphasis on transition finance there. A lot of emphasis on mobilizing capital for emerging markets. And finally, you've got growing interest of regulators and policymakers in overseeing the transition plans of financial firms and where and how they're channeling this finance.
No, thank you very much, Sonia. I think that's a very important point you made. And the challenge now is to, as the President said, how do we make them granular so they are specific to a single region's, every country's context, so that we do not get into the mode where we see this as a uniform distributions rather than something that is country specifics. Let's hear from our infrastructure leaders in terms of closing that gap, and that's where most of the resources will go. Our president often said he is for essentially adaptation, more adaptations.
Thank you very much. Thanks for this opportunity, and thanks to my esteemed panelists for the opening remarks. I agree with most of the direction set by Orama around having different parts. That is very true. I also agree with a lot of the comments that Sonia made around risk premiums and access to finance. I would like to take this slightly differently, within the same context, but to highlight that this is an important occasion for Africa. For the first time, we have a congestion of issues for which Africa is at the heart of the solutions. And I want us to take a moment to assimilate that, because I think a partnership with Africa going forward is what will lead to a resolution of most of these issues. Sonia mentioned the rising interest rates, the very challenged macroeconomic environment that we have. More importantly is an environment in which supply is significantly constrained. So we have a situation where the crisis that we have is around supply, but we're trying to deal with it from a demand side. So instead of thinking of or looking at how do we increase supply of the resources, of the energy that the world needs, because we know that we're expecting our 8 billionth person. So globally, population is growing. In Africa in particular, where we have the fastest growing population with the least access to energy. Think about it. In Africa, we're consuming on average 180 kilowatt per hour. That is 1.3% of the 13,000 kilowatt per hour consumed in the United States. That is 2.76% of the 6,500 kilowatt per hour consumed in Europe. So clearly, we must have different parts. And for us, we're trying to solve for energy access, not energy transition. It is about how do the 970 million people without access to clean cooking have that access? And how can we provide that access at a sustainable cost over a period of time? And I go back to the earlier remarks, which is around resources. So Africa has most of the resources that the world needs. Africa today can be the growth engine for the world. And it's important that we realize that. And if we think about the scale of the opportunity for the resources that are required for us to achieve electric mobility and for us to achieve net zero, then we know that we have to be looking at resources differently. Here again, Africa has a big role to play. And what we think is important is for African leaders, all of us African leaders, to understand that this is a moment for us and we should negotiate about how we are going to utilize the resources for the energy transition and for global net zero. It is so important that we don't continue to mine or produce raw materials and raw minerals for export. We shouldn't be exporting raw cobalt, raw copper, raw bauxite, raw lithium, raw nickel. All of these minerals and resources are required for electric mobility, which is a key component of the energy transition. So we must be thinking of how do we do processing of these resources on the continent in a way that we create jobs for Africans, in a way that we structurally transform our economies. And this is something that we've done already. It's not something that is new. So for example, one of our industrial zones is just the first industrial carbon-free or carbon-neutral industrial zone in the world. And this is certified by SGS. So we can't take a different path to industrialization, and we can do it in a clean and efficient way. All we need to do is to have a conversation about how do we mobilize the capital that's required for us to do so. How do we get over this risk premium, prejudice risk premium, I would say, perception for the continent? And I'll give you examples. So companies or institutions or countries with the same rating get access to financing differently. Most African countries are paying sometimes up to 280 basis points for the same rating when they are accessing the market. So these are the conversations that we need to have, and these are the bottlenecks that I think we need to overcome. And how do we overcome them? I think that we can do that by, one, having a consensus around, again here I would say thank you to all the nations that have agreed to repurpose their SDRs to poorer nations in Africa. We thank them for that, but we think that we need to make progress fast, because without that access, we continue to receive nothing. And I'll give you an example so that we can understand what we're talking about. All of African countries received $33 billion in SDRs in 2021. That is 89% what one European country received, just one. So imagine 1.3 billion people, 54 countries, receiving 89% of what one country receives. So clearly, the action that has been made there is good. We need to accelerate it so that we can have better access. And that is just going to be like the base for the reform that is required. The next thing we should be looking at is how can we repurpose aid and technical assistance and development towards de-risking capital flows. So one of the big challenges we have, and I'd like Sonia here and our friends at IRF to really have a conversation as to why or what it will take for Africa to be on the asset allocation for global capital. We need to have that conversation. What do you need to be able to allocate capital to Africa? And I think that once we have that conversation, we can start to work. But what we know works and what we have used in the past is insurance, credit frustration insurance, and loan loss insurance. So if we can find a way to have as a first tranche insurance from the global north, and we can layer on that commercial insurance, and then the capital that we have, we will see a lot more flows into Africa. So $1 billion in insurance can catalyze $16 billion of investable funds. Think about that. We're talking about scale. That is how we achieve scale. So we should be thinking of how do we deploy capital in a way that allows us to achieve scale. And that scale is also important for how we actually build the infrastructure that we need. Everything here is more expensive in Africa. Why? Because we don't have bargaining power. So we need to look at how we build bargaining power for more holistic procurement that allows us to have the value that we should have. And I think I go back to the opportunity that we have with the energy transition, with the minerals and metals for batteries. We have to use that opportunity to negotiate. We have to use that opportunity to ensure that we build the circular economies that are required to propel growth and to also prevent immigration. You know, Professor Rahman mentioned the link, and the link is real because Africans don't really want to go out. It's just that their opportunities are not there. And we need to find a way of creating those opportunities so that we can keep Africans in Africa because we need their productivity for growth. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, CEO Soumaila. I think you raised a number of issues, the link between energy poverty and poverty, but you also took us back to what didn't work in the combustion engine era, where we have 13% of oil mineral reserve, and yet we are energy poor. And what you're arguing is that in the green mineral space, we have to make sure that we do things differently by making sure that those minerals are used within the continent to power our economies. Should I assume, next question now, is that we all agree that if there is no climate finance, just climate finance, there wouldn't be a just climate transitions?
Certainly, I mean, that is clearly the case. We don't need to talk about it, and you mentioned it in your opening. And, you know, for us, I keep talking about the opportunity that Africa has. So if you think about it, I'm going by the example you said, you know, African countries produce natural gas, and they export that natural gas as energy feedstock for Europe, Asia, and the rest of the world. But we don't have energy. You know, right now, there was a conversation, or there is a conversation about producing more natural gas, again, to Europe, Asia, and the rest of the world. What I'm saying is, yes, but that natural gas needs to be used in Africa. You know, we need that natural gas for industrialization in Africa. We need that natural gas to process cobalt, lithium, nickel into batteries. We can't be thinking of taking natural gas to Europe for further energy intensity in Europe. We will never achieve net zero. The way to achieve net zero is to look at the supply chain of the world and redesign it in a way that we have significant production in Africa using African resources. And another example is this. We have 60% of the best solar sources on the globe, 60%. Less than 1% is built. So as we acquire energy, we can use renewable energy. But we can't import solar panels from the rest of the world. We have natural gas here, we have sand here. We have to make those solar panels here. If you think about the scale of what is required, to ship all of that into Africa, it's not going to make any sense. You know, so we need to think of building circular economies, and financing for those circular economies is what will lead to just transition. To do it otherwise is going to add to further carbon emissions, and we will not achieve net zero.
Thank you very much. Let's now turn to the President. Because I think we've discussed a number of reasons why green financing, or more generally, financing is not flowing within the continent. We talked about the perception premium. What are other reasons that you can think of which are constraining the normal flows of financing, green financing within the African continent, where the needs are significant and where the costs are also so huge?
Well, the reasons are so many. I must tell you that. You know, we like to talk about risk. We like to talk about other, especially risk. But I tell you that sometimes risk disappears when political will in major capitals have a different view of risk. When money, when the crisis in Iraq wasn't even over. It wasn't even over. Can you check how much money went into Iraq? Including money from multilateral development banks. Africa never got anything. Oh, okay. I don't want to talk about Ukraine because they don't want to talk about it. So what I'm trying to say, and I've said it before, It is the same thing about the issue of competitiveness. We are told that Africa is where it is because we are not competitive. And I say that the idea of competition, in the global context, is a contrived notion to deceive those the world wants to leave behind. Because some countries in Asia, when investment started going there, I don't think they were more competitive than Africa. In fact, in the 1980s, Africa was doing better than Asia, including China. It was the debt crisis in Latin America that affected everybody, that made Africa to go into difficulties in the 1980s. But it was the same 1980s that the Asian economies got all the money they got to become what they are today. So I think what led to that was something more than competition. With regard to China, we know America wanted China to be wealthy. And they thought that would change things in China in one way or the other. So more investments went there. So it's the same thing with money and risk. If we believe today or if some of the rich economies want to make money to come to Africa today, Rosa Whittaker has said several times, it's okay, give a tax break. Tell anybody who invests in Africa, all your investments will come back tax-free. You will see how money will come here. If that is happening.
That's perfect. In fact,
because I want to say that because it is very important that we understand that, and understanding that, and I'm not saying that to blame anybody, by the way. It's just to say that all these things that we think are the drivers are underpinned by another thing. Geopolitics, national security of countries. So if Africa wants to come up the radar from a geopolitics point of view, we have to do the AFCFT and become very important. So that when people are sitting in those capitals where those decisions are made, they take notice. To do that, we have to take our destiny in our hands first. And it was only then that competitiveness becomes important. Risk becomes important. Because you're already a goal. People can then decide how they go to the goal. But if you're not a goal, who goes? You can you can do the race to the bottom in removing all the taxes for people to come and invest in her country, in Sierra Leone. Iron ore is mined. Hundreds of millions of dollars of iron ore is exported. They get less than $100 million in revenue. How can that be possible? It's not possible. Because of the race to the bottom to attract, to be competitive. That's not competition. So I will come back to the other issue about the liquidity premium.
Please, President,
that speaks to some of the things that Samala mentioned. Please. Why somebody who is a country rated similar to another country outside Africa pays far less than the African country pays when they go to issue bonds or issue debt in the international market. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I think you've heard the debate, the fact that the flows of funds is actually determined by several other factors, including the global geopolitics, where we think the world should be. And it's often said that there was something called the triangulations, where Russia was triangulated out in the 70s after Nixon's visit to China. Now there is a new triangulations. Now this time is Russia and China triangulating the US out. And you see, as a result of that, we've seen, as to go back to the president, what the president said, the whole issue on the semiconductor, the tech issue, and the trade war, the tech war, is actually now constraining the capital flow that you talked about, the outflows from emerging market economies. I think under those conditions, what do you think should be done to actually incentivize global banks to do for Africa what they did for Asia in terms of investing so much money to transform the economies so that we can reduce that correlation between growth and commodities, which has been credit rating negative?
Absolutely. Well, you said you were going to put me in the hot seat, so I'm in the hot seat now. I'm all ready to go here. And look, what I'm going to say here, I've been working in markets for close to 30 years now. I'm dating myself. But I've watched, and I've always been focused on emerging markets, right? I started out as an analyst and have visited many emerging market countries. And this question of how you get finance to emerging markets has always been very central to my own work and to the work of the IIF, where I am now. So that's the kind of perspective where this is coming from. And I just have a few ideas here. I mean, one is that we financial firms need to use our voice to advocate to governments and policymakers to have the right environment, the right policy environment to channel this kind of finance. And I mentioned the carbon pricing, but there's also broader climate policy. So for example, does it make sense to tell financial firms, okay, don't finance companies that make plastic straws, because plastic straws are bad for the environment? Well, doesn't it make more sense to just say outlaw plastic straws, tell the companies not to make any more plastic straws? It's very indirect to try to use the financial sector to drive that kind of change. It's not a good policy environment. So governments need to be braver, you know? They need to set the right environment to allow climate finance to flourish and transition finance. The same thing goes to the regulatory environment. Banks care an awful lot about regulators and what regulators think and say. So our message to regulators has to be, don't just automatically penalize brown investments. Our job is not just to finance wind and solar and carbon capture. That's all really important to finance the green, but we got to turn the brown to green. And unfortunately, it is the case that most emerging market economies are heavily reliant on fossil fuel energy. They just are. It's a fact of life. It's less expensive, and it's a core element of transition for emerging markets to be able to bring down the cost of alternative energies so that they can have a just transition. You can't just sort of turn off the financing for fossil fuel energy. It just is inhumane. So that's another point. Then you've mentioned the de-risking and the insurance, bringing down the cost of those tools. Because it's all great, right? If you look at political risk insurance or that type of product, they're fine, but it's a small market, in part because it costs a lot to provide that kind of insurance. So you're right, that the cost of that needs to come down. And here I'd mention the potential for blended finance, so bringing together finance from multilaterals, along with also philanthropic capital, which, if you blend these sources, you can come up with some very innovative structures that give every type of investor what they need. Because different investors have different preferences in the capital stack, right? Some of them want equity-like investments, some of them want straight debt, some of them want plain vanilla stuff, some are more incentivized to take risks. So we got to offer a menu of ways to invest to make this happen. Another point that I think is changing over the years is that the private sector is doing a better job, I hope, of communicating what they need more to emerging market governments and the companies that they want to invest in. So instead of just the IMF and the World Bank doing this kind of training and technology transfer and capacity building, the private sector is doing a little bit more of that directly and saying things like, okay, we need this kind of legal framework. We need this kind of certainty in the regulatory environment or property rights or human rights or whatever it is. Those communication channels are improving, and also investor relations in emerging economies are improving. So those are good things. The private sector is also doing more to help with the development of local markets. Local markets, as you've said, are so very important. It can't just be external capital forever. Local markets have to develop, and global banks can help with that. They have the expertise. They have the know-how. And one other point here that I think is really important. In order to bring this risk premium down, this, whether it's a misperceived risk premium or whatever, we need to do a better job. Emerging markets need to do a better job in highlighting and selling the business opportunities around transition, because they are massive and they're not well understood. This is where the growth is. Africa, as you've said, you mentioned the strong growth, stronger than Asia, that potential is there. It's just not well understood. And in this way, this day where we can message so easily, we need to do more in making sure that investors reach this. So all of these things together can help tap the global ESG investor base. And this is where I think the magic happens, right?
Thank you very much. Let's go back to the President about, for him to elaborate a bit more on the perception premium issue. And then to add a little twist to that, President, I think we are in a world where, in terms of asset under management, $210 trillion, about twice the size of the world GDPs. And people wonder, why should we have to choose between saving the planet and investing those $210 trillion? And why should the perception premium be a constraint to the point we are willing to let the planet disappear, the only thing we have, because of the perception premium? If we could actually analyze the perception premium issue with that angle, that will help a lot in terms of expanding the debate.
Yeah, okay, it's working. No, thank you. You see, I think it's difficult to break up the premium, that Africa attracts into risk and liquidity. Because the premium is there, we assume every time is a risk. Part of the problem, and that was why I gave the background I gave, is we don't have many actors investing in African issuances. Not many people invest. They are the least liquid. And because they're the least liquid, not many people invest. They are more expensive than those who have the liquidity. And it's also partly a problem of the infrastructure, so call it that. We do not have a functioning repo market. So whereas you have trillions of dollars of bonds issued by the other markets being repoed and all that, the liquidity is there. So that brings the pricing down. The liquidity premium goes down, which we don't have. That is why, as you know, Dr. Fofak, we have worked with the UNECA to introduce the liquidity and sustainability facility, which we hopefully launch in terms of the first deal in a few days' time here at the COP. We are hoping that will open the African repo market. We are doing the first deal as a President Bank funding that first deal with one of the leading global banks. We are really happy that partnering with us are the big global banks. leading asset management companies, leading fund managers, because it's an indication that this will catch on. And we believe that if it catches on, and with the bias we want to give it towards SDG bonds, then it will become cheaper, more attractive, and people will be more incentivized to issue SDG bonds, because there will be people willing to buy it, knowing that should they need liquidity at any time, there is a facility available where they can place it for that liquidity. That is the missing link in the capital market structure Africa has today, which we want to deal with. Now, if we're able to deal with them and they will start working, then we can begin to see where the risk premium is on the continent. We can then disaggregate and know that with that, with the liquidity premium, most of the premium we are seeing would then be risk. And that is then what may make it easier, actually, to get insurance cheaper. Because the noise about premium that is created by the liquidity aspect will have been taken care of. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President. I think this is very important. I think the LSF is the key. I would like us to stay on that question a little bit, Mr. President. I think when you look at what happened within the European Union just a few weeks ago, when they started rising, increasing the interest rate, we saw the spread in Southern Europe, Italy and Spain rising rapidly again. And then the ECB put together a new instrument, the protection mechanism, and the spread cooled down. What role do you see African Central Bank playing along the LSF to make sure that we have a system that is actually broad support within the whole continent?
No, thank you very much. No, what we've been discussing with the central banks, most of whom are customers in terms of depositors, to see how they work with us to make the LSF, the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility, deeper and more effective, because you benefit everybody on the continent. Given that over the years we've been able to build strong relationship with the central banks, having raised more than $25 billion for them, we are thinking, and we have told them not thinking, that they should consider joining us so that we use part of their reserves to support the LSF. Because supporting the LSF also supports their countries, because it will then bring the debt we need for African bonds. If we bring the debt, then of course, because the yields shrink, the debt situation will become better, because the debt service situation will be improved. So if we're able to then get them on board, what you're saying can happen. If we see a situation where the market is disturbed by whatever, we're able to draw on the reserves to support whatever market is affected. I mean, depending on the year, the central banks hold between $350 to $500 billion in reserves in Africa. But most of them are held outside. If we are able to get just a bit of that to also go into the LSF, then we will have the debt we are looking for to support the bonds that are out there and new ones that can be issued, especially green bonds and SDG bonds. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Dr. Subaila. I think you started talking about some innovative financing instrument that one can think of. You talked about insurance, the guarantees. I would like you to actually expand on those within the context of the green financing setting.
Good. So that's a good question, but before I proceed, I would like to acknowledge the good work that Professor Rama just mentioned on the liquidity support facility. That is a very important piece of work. And I think that we need to find a way to accelerate implementation and to find a way of getting the African governments to understand the importance of that in access to capital. So if you just look at how Europe and America were able to mobilize on the fiscal side during COVID, and the fact that Africa was not able to do so, it's because of liquidity. It's simply because of that. So an instrument like this is very important going forward. And I think that this is something that we also like to support, because this is for the good of all of Africa. So that's a very good initiative, and well done for that. So at the Africa Finance Corporation, we launched an infrastructure climate resilient fund. The purpose of that is to look at the technology of blended finance and to use that at scale to mobilize capital for us to incorporate climate risk in fiscal infrastructure build. We know that we need over $2 trillion for infrastructure in Africa. And the fact that most of that infrastructure is not built allows us to do it differently, bearing in mind the fact that we are the most impacted by the devastating effects of climate change. We have drought, we have floods. Just recently, we had a massive flood in Nigeria. Over 600 people were killed. About 1.3 million people were displaced. So this is just going to continue, and we know that it's going to continue. So how do we build the infrastructure that help reduce this risk going forward? Which is why we launched that Infrastructure Climate Resilient Fund. And again, it's looking at the blended finance architecture. How do we create, a first loss tranche, a layer on top of it, commercial institutional capital, and then on top of that, we have typical fund flow. The same technology can be used for insurance, and it's very important that they work in a stepwise way, because if we are attacking risk premium, we need to find a way of first getting people in the door. So if we find a way of having non-payment insurance to mobilize investable flows into the continent, and then we layer on top of that the liquidity support facility, which is essentially a large repo market, then we have solved the problem. And we need to look at it, in stages. First, we need to find a way through political means, through dialogue with IIF, to understand what it takes for them to have Africa as part of the asset allocation. Because to the point, Africa has no asset allocation. And we need to get Africa to be on the map for asset allocation. Then we now have a conversation around how do we de-risk flows, and then once those flows go, then we have the repo market to provide the liquidity that makes it a virtuous cycle for continuous capital.
No, thank you very much. I think let's hear from Sonia. I think you mentioned something very important in terms of asset allocation, but the reality, back to you again, is that those asset managers, by rule and regulations, are pressed to be out of what they call the junk bond, the non-investment grade. So how do we go around that to make sure that Africa become part of it? As you reflect on your answer.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting questions. I was listening to your remarks on insurance. And one particularly exciting development in sustainability bond markets and ESG bond markets is this idea of a sustainability-linked loan or bond. And in a way, it's a little bit like self-insurance, a way to improve your own credit rating, by your own efforts. So, for example, you might have key performance indicators, KPIs, they call them. So if you fulfill all of the promises, like say you're going to do a green bond, a green bond, how have you achieved those targets? Then you get a cheaper cost of financing. If you don't, then the cost of financing goes up. So there's a lot of promising developments here to sort of tap into this ESG market, but it involves a lot of work on transparency and better provision of ESG data and information to investors.
Thank you very much. I think, I know we are pressed with time, so what I would like to propose is that we go through a round of closing remark, and let's start with Subaira, please. please.
Thank you. So I think that we have made some progress at this COP. We have managed to get loss and damage on the agenda, so that's a big step. I also mentioned the conversations around SDRs. That's another big step. I think the next step now is how can we have conversations around mobilizing capital into Africa? What will it take, for global capital to consider Africa? And how can we implement the financial innovation for those flows to come through? More importantly, how can we look at the supply chain of the world today as it exists and make sure that we are looking at how Africa becomes a key part of the processing of the materials and resources that it has for the electric mobility. We can't just sell raw materials. We are not going to sell cobalt, copper, and lithium and nickel. We have to sell batteries instead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's hear from Sonia, your closing remark. Mm-hmm.
I won't stand between you and your dinner or drinks or what have you, and I won't summarize everything I've said. I just want to leave you with one message, and that is, this exact kind of dialogue between investors, borrowing countries, and I would include policymakers, regulators in the equation, development banks, Africa Finance. It's exactly what we need to solve these problems, because we can only solve them collectively, right? To unlock this kind of private finance for development in Africa, it just has to be an ongoing. Nobody said it's going to be easy. We got to keep having these conversations before dinner, but it's tremendously important. And congratulations to you for organizing it.
Thank you very much. I think you have the last word, President.
Thank you, Hippolyte. I just draw from what my colleagues on the panel have said to also say, I think we are making progress here. I know that the negotiations are continuing. I know they will be tough because everybody is trying to make sure their positions become the narrative and what the rules become. But progress has been made. For Africa, what I think we should do is to make sure we begin to convey the message of a differentiated need and responsibility and use it as a basis to create a new asset class of climate finance. So instead of just calling it green bond, green finance, call it adaptation bond, and adaptation finance, so that it can also lead to the development of rules that can create that asset class that probably funds can go to. Instead of going into this whole bucket, and when we get the figures, if you want to separate them, you see, adaptation financing got only 20%, whereas the people who need it constitute 80% of the world. So we need to separate it, and I think that is an important thing. If it comes out of here, it doesn't have to be done through the negotiations. Africans and the other developing countries need to begin to promote that idea, and I believe and hope that it will catch on with banks and so on. The second thing is the tiering of the kind of funding required in this climate finance issue. There are countries that can borrow commercially, they can issue bonds and do other things. There are countries that we need concessional funding and some grants. But we know that because of the difficulties everywhere in the world, the donor countries are having issues. Their citizens are under stress, so increasingly becoming difficult to justify to some citizens in some countries why they must continue to give donations and grants to others. So I think we should also find a new nomenclature for the grants that can come or must come to support the low-income countries, to support, say, project preparation and things like that in Africa and perhaps other developing countries or low-income countries. I think if we phrase it in the form of carbon, accumulated carbon credit compensation payments, so that it is seen as payment for the past carbon that have been released, and that then they have to give us grants to deal with it. Perhaps the citizens who really, most of them really want to deal with this environmental issue may find it more acceptable for those grants to go. Because if you just say grants, people are tired of grants. So I think for me, these are the two main things, and also to tell you to look out for the announcement and launch of the first liquidity and sustainability facility deal in a few days' time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think we should give our high-level panel a stronger round of applause than what we've heard so far. We did tell there was going to be a very vibrant intellectual debate beyond financing. That's what we heard. We also heard that there is a consensus on the climate issue. I think we now have to mobilize at the global level. As the President said, it's not just the risk, it's also the political will, which actually trump the risk perceptions. So we should be talking to the financier, but also to the donor community, the global node. And thank you very much for your attention. Wishing you a great dinner. Thank you very much.
Hey, test mic. Hey, test. 1 2 1 2. Hey, test. Hello, check.